I've spent the past few videos discussing the immense amount of diversity and beauty of the human species, and I hope that's given you all a small insight into my mind and how I view the world, which everyone will have a different perspective on, of course. One nation's tragedy is another's national holiday, and in today's video we are going to objectively discuss major historical shifts in human populations around the globe regarding ethnicity, religion, genetics, and language from a neutral position without malice or resentment. Let's ignore the obvious, as in the American continent, as pretty much everyone is aware of the massive changes that took place in the continents in the last half millennia, as 95% of people in the region have at least some immigrant roots. There are countless examples of villages, cities, and even entire nations being completely displaced for as long as humans have started keeping records, mostly due to tribalism and other self-centered human tendencies. Now, a lot of this can be attributed to mass migration, genocide, disease, ethnic and racial intermixing, and ethnic cleansing. And which single man can take the crown for the king of the ethnic cleansers other than Joseph Stalin? Well, this man single-handedly twisted the Soviet Union to his liking, essentially treating it as his own personal empire. Stalin's anti-Semitic policies and attitudes are something very rarely discussed in the United States, but was very well known in the USSR, with the overwhelming majority of Jews in the region fleeing to Israel in the decades following World War II, so it would surprise many to know that Stalin actually planned for a Jewish homeland to be established in the very borders of the Soviet Union. Well, 5,000 miles away from Moscow in the middle of Siberia, but we'll get to that later on. First, let's discuss some of the lesser-known acts that have radically changed the demographics of large swaths of territory. The Armenians have undoubtedly had it pretty rough in the region in the past couple thousand years, being pushed around by the Romans, Persians, Mongols, Ottomans, and Soviets, and this has contributed to the massive Armenian diaspora around the globe today. Although records are sketchy, Armenians probably constituted 30 to 50% of eastern Anatolia in the late 19th century, and directly after World War I, mid-sized chunks of Turkey were granted to Greece and Armenia as reprisals for the Greek and Armenian genocides respectively. However, Turkey quickly regained the lost territory, expelling the last of the Greeks and Armenians, although a very large, albeit unknown amount converted to Islam and changed their names to Turkish ones to blend in, and their descendants today could number in the hundreds of thousands to millions. Some political parties in Armenia and a not so insignificant chunk of the population believes that at least some of this region should rightfully be given to the Armenian nation today. However, in all likelihood, this is incredibly unrealistic, not only being a logistical and diplomatic nightmare, having to transfer millions of people to and from the region, but the ensuing chaos would likely result in a large regional war, as the breakaway of Nagorno-Karabakh has shown, which was a significantly smaller area. But of course, I would be amiss to portray the ethnic cleansing during this period as one-sided, as huge numbers of ethnic Turks and Tartars were expelled from the Black Sea region to Turkey, and in many areas of the Balkans, the Islamic population was virtually eliminated. Before the Balkan Wars and the mass independence movements that swept through the Ottoman Empire, Turks and fellow Turkic groups like the Crimean Tatars made up a majority in northeast Bulgaria and the region of Dobruja in modern Romania, as well as making up a large minority in many Aegean islands such as Crete and Rhodes. However, the majority of these Turks were repatriated back to Turkey following the population exchanges between the Balkans and Anatolia after World War I, and in Bulgaria, an especially large migration wave occurred in the 1980s due to a state-sponsored anti-Turkish backlash. It really is difficult to overstate just how horrific genocides were in world history, with entire families taken from their homes and executed in the most brutal of ways, sometimes right in the open. But of course, you don't need me to tell you about how dismal world history can be sometimes. One positive is that usually people are far more apprehensive to kill their fellow man than you might think, and even when neighboring groups despise each other, they would much rather the others simply move away rather than actually doing the unthinkable and committing mass genocide. Usually. Still, extreme tensions between ethnic or religious groups could lead to mass deportations, collapses in infrastructure, and even race riots, and nobody likes race riots. Now, let's take a step outside of the old world for a minute to look at the new one. As I've talked about in the past, the entirety of Texas, my home state, used to be a Spanish and later Mexican territory known as Coahuila and Tejas. Although very little is known about the demographics of the American Southwest before incorporation into the United States, it is known that the area was extremely scarcely populated, having a population density 5 times lower than Alaska has now, with roaming tribes of Amerindians, along with small settlements of Spaniards, along with mestizos and castizos, who had migrated from other, more densely populated areas of Mexico. Legal and illegal immigrants from the Southern American states of mostly Protestant Anglo-Celtic stock settled areas of Texas before quickly becoming a majority, breaking off and becoming a part of the English-speaking United States as opposed to Spanish-speaking Mexico. And now some professors, such as Julian Trujillo, have argued that an ironic reversal of this is now occurring, with many legal and illegal Mexican immigrants once again shifting the demographics of the region back to a majority Hispanic background, although I attest firsthand that immigrants from Asia, especially China, India, and Vietnam, have very quickly overtaken Latino immigrants in many cities. One of the more bizarre shifts in the South American continent after colonization was in the country of Paraguay, a traditionally Hispanic country nestled between Argentina and Brazil, and is the only remaining country on Earth where a majority of the population speaks an indigenous Amerindian language, Guarani. Despite the overwhelming majority of the population being of mestizo, castizo, or European origin, the country has a unique position where over 90% of the Paraguayan population is fluent in both Guarani and Spanish, an interesting quirk of Paraguayan history wherein the indigenous culture has had a disproportionate impact on the modern population. But of course, everyone knows about the mass migration and changes that took place in the Americas, but one other area of the world that had an equally dramatic change in racial makeup that left it unrecognizable was Southeast Asia. As I've discussed in a previous video, around 10,000 years ago, a massive wave of migrants from East Asia flooded into Indochina and the Malay archipelago, assimilating, displacing, and confining many of the original peoples of the region. This has contributed to the extreme genetic and phenotypic diversity between the remaining populations of the former Sundaland, as gene pools isolated and confined to small spaces on islands will quickly diverge from other populations. The Ita of the Philippines and Orang Asli of Malaysia have a distinct appearance and culture from the Andamanese of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands of India, although admittedly a large part of this can be attributed to admixture with the latter groups of Austronesians and Austroasiatic peoples from the north. A similar effect can be seen in virtually all of Africa south of the equator, where Bantus from Cameroon conquered nearly the entirety of the region, absorbing the indigenous peoples that previously inhabited the area. And in my opinion, the fact that many consider the Khoisan, Nilotes, Kushites, and Bantus to be of the same race is complete insanity, considering not only the huge differences in language and culture, but appearance as well, with the genetic distance between, say, a Khoi and a Somali is actually greater than that between Europeans and East Asians. And speaking of Europeans and East Asians, this brings us to the establishment of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast in 1928. And make no mistake, Stalin did this not as a favor to the Jewish people, but rather to erect a buffer zone between Slavic settlers of the Far East and the Chinese and Japanese, both of whom had territorial ambitions in this relatively young Russian frontier. Interestingly, the JAO was largely a success upon its implementation, attracting tens of thousands of Jewish settlers from further west in the Soviet Union, as well as even a handful of families from the United States, reaching a peak percentage of 25 to 30% of the entire JAO, with the remainder being ethnic Russians or Ukrainians, although the Jewish population quickly plummeted after World War II, when the overwhelming majority of Russian Jews fled to Israel or the United States. Despite ethnic Jews only making up 1% of the JAO's population today, the region has maintained its name as the Jewish Autonomous Oblast as a reference to its unique history as a former Jewish homeland on the border of China, and only a stone's throw away from North Korea. As for the future of the world, it appears that in the US, the African, Latino, and Asian populations will greatly increase in the future, and in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, the Chinese and Indian populations have been skyrocketing in major cities in the recent past, so who knows, maybe in the future we'll all have to learn some kind of Hindi Mandarin Creole. I hope you all enjoyed this less structured video, as it was a lot of fun to make, and I noticed that people do talk about this kind of stuff a lot more on many online forums, but generally speaking, they're pretty much exclusively self-segregated by ethnicity or nationality, and when you throw everyone of every background, belief system, and political affiliation together, like in the comment section of this channel, you're bound to get a lot of conflict, which is sometimes deeply saddening and sometimes very humorous. I realize that a lot of this is just trolling and some just blowing off steam. And yeah, I get it, I do have a sense of humor. And of course, this video wouldn't be complete if I didn't address the elephant in the room. That's right, I'm talking about ancient Egypt. We're all thinking it. Nah, I'm just kidding. Or am I? Nah. Be sure to let me know which regional, ethnic, racial, linguistic, or religious shift has piqued your interest in the recent past, as there are literally hundreds of examples I couldn't mention. Try to keep the comments somewhat decent. Kids read that stuff, you know. As always, thank you all for watching. It's been Mason, and I'll see you next time.